listener production.
Hi, Natarsha Belling with you and welcome to the afternoon edition of The Briefing. Before we get into this episode, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander listeners are advised that this episode contains the name of an Indigenous person who has passed away. Coming up in our deep dive, the federal government is under growing pressure to step in over an increasing rate of Aboriginal incarceration and deaths in custody. Calls are growing for an independent review into the death of 24-year-old Kumanjayi White, who allegedly died after being restrained by Northern Territory Police at a supermarket in Alice Springs last month. And over the weekend, another Indigenous man died while in police custody, this time at Darwin Hospital. We chat with the lawyer representing the White family, who's calling for urgent action. But first, let's check the afternoon headlines this Thursday, the 12th of June. The Shadow Defence Minister is asking whether the federal government's recent sanctions on two Israeli ministers could be behind a move by the US to review our multi-billion-dollar AUKUS deal. Just days before our PM and the US President are set to meet at the G7 summit, the Trump administration has announced a major review of the AUKUS deal and whether the US should pull out of the $368 billion partnership. The Shadow Defence Minister Angus Taylor is demanding answers, asking exactly what the Defence Minister knew and when, and wants to know if the recent sanctioning of the Israeli ministers helped spark the turnaround.
Was the government's position on sanctioning two Israeli ministers a contributor to triggering the timing or the existence of this review in the first place? What are the terms of reference of the review?
But the Defence Minister, Richard Marles, has told the ABC no one needs to panic.
The agreement is for the submarines to come in the early 2030s, and that is what we are all working to, and I'm very confident.
The National Anti-Corruption Commission has ruled out any corruption in the $2.4 million compensation payout to Brittany Higgins after her allegations of a sexual assault at Parliament House. The watchdog says there was, quote, no inappropriate intervention in the process by or on behalf of any minister. The multi-million-dollar payout was made in relation to future lost earnings, medical bills, legal costs, and also the distress Miss Higgins endured. And after a fiery war of words as their bromance broke down very publicly last week, billionaire Elon Musk has apologised to the US president. The Tesla owner and the world's richest man saying on his social media platform X overnight, quote, I regret some of my posts about President Donald Trump last week. They went too far. The new statement saw Tesla's shares rise steadily after plummeting during the public fallout last week. Now it's time to get into our deep dive of the concerning increase in Indigenous deaths in custody. Protests are growing across the country after the death of a 24-year-old in Alice Springs. His family and a number of politicians and other groups are now calling for an independent review and the federal government to step in. A call already rejected by the Northern Territory government and the Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese.
In general, the idea of federal intervention, which is frankly an easy thing that people come up with. You know, why aren't you sending the AFP? Why aren't you doing that without then saying where it leads? I need to be convinced that people in Canberra know better than people in the Northern Territory about how to deal with these issues, is my starting point. But we do need to engage directly and constructively with First Nations people.
Human rights lawyer George Newhouse, who is representing the White family, says widespread reform and long overdue action is urgently needed. George, thank you so much for joining us. If you can just explain the circumstances of Mr. White passing away. I understand it was last Tuesday in Alice Springs.
Yes, look, there's a lot we don't know, and there's a police investigation underway. But what we know from public statements is that Kumanjayi White was at a Coles supermarket. There seems to have been some kind of argument with a security guard. He was restrained And at some point during that restraint, he was found to be unconscious. He was taken to hospital, and unfortunately, he was declared deceased. And there's currently an autopsy and a police investigation underway.
George, not only is the White family calling for an independent review, so are a number of high-profile politicians, including the Indigenous Australians Minister and also Amnesty International and some of the biggest land councils in the Northern Territory. Why is the Northern Territory continuing to reject these growing calls for an independent review or investigation?
Well, you'd have to ask the police and the government of the Northern Territory. I mean, there's a complete breakdown of trust between many Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and the police in Australia. And that comes from a long and ongoing history of systemic discrimination, violence and injustice. And that distrust is not irrational. You know, it's deep-rooted, it's evidence-based, and it comes from a long history of harm and neglect and injustice. And for the response of the officials in the Northern Territory to be a complete disregard for the family, it's extremely disappointing, but for them it's a continuation of the injustice that they've suffered since colonisation.
George, you talk about the statistics, and they're not just statistics. These are victims and their families that have been affected through generational situations. The stats show that 1/3 of the deaths in custody have been Aboriginal people, but they make up just 3% of the population.
Yes. I mean, the statistics are shocking. Not only are they around 23-24% of all deaths in custody, but they're younger. The number of First Nations deaths in custody are generally of younger people. There are more suicides. There are more unnatural deaths. It's just a shocking statistic. And really, it's 35 years since the Royal Commission into Aboriginal Deaths in Custody made a series of extremely important recommendations. They haven't been implemented in full. Some of them haven't been implemented at all. And if they had, Kumanjayi White might be alive today.
You make a great point there, George. This is not just about deaths in custody. We see royal commissions and investigations into serious issues across our country all the time, and none of the recommendations are ever enforced. Why are they not enforced? We have the evidence, we know what's going wrong, and there are possible solutions.
They're not enforced essentially for the same reason that First Nations people don't trust the police. It does not suit the authorities to enforce recommendations that empower First Nations people, that divert them away from the criminal justice system. We have a political system that admires getting tough on crime when in fact it's costing $1 million a year to hold First Nations kids in custody. If that money was spent on them, imagine the difference that would make in their lives. But instead, we run law and order policies. Actually implementing Royal Commission and other inquiry recommendations does not suit our politicians, and there's a complete lack of will to implement them.
In regards to this latest death in custody, your opinion, George, is that we've then seen protests sparked right across the nation. This is again cutting through. It's not a situation in Alice Springs. It's still a situation that is affecting so many people right across our country.
Yes. And it is. That frustration is pent up. You've seen it appear in rallies right across Australia. The family of Kumanjayi White are calling for transparency. They're calling for accountability, respect, and for justice for the deceased. And that's a call that's been reflected amongst many First Nations and other Australians right across the nation. They're appearing at rallies. They're demanding that the police who were involved in this incident be stood down while a criminal investigation is taking place. They want independent investigators or independent oversight over the investigation into his death. They want to see the CCTV footage because they don't believe the negative narrative. And they're really hurt by police representatives making disparaging and denigrating comments about their loved one when they aren't allowed to speak out at all about the circumstances of his death. So with 600 deaths in custody since the Royal Commission report 35 years ago, it's time for change. And that's the call from these rallies around our nation.
A time for change. We know crime is a huge issue across Australia, but so is the discrimination against First Nations people. These rallies are calling for action. What is the action that you would like to see, not in a decade, not in 2 years, but now?
I think there's a number of critical measures that need to be implemented, but in this case, the criminalisation and over-policing of a disabled 24-year-old Aboriginal man in a coal store led to his death. This was not, a mass murderer. He died over lollies. And I think that if this was a non-Indigenous person, I doubt that the same circumstances would have occurred and that person would be alive today. There's a history of violence against First Nations people. Those attitudes, they're actually deeply entrenched racist attitudes that run across police forces across the country. They need to change. We need to divert First Nations people away from the criminal justice system so that they can lead more productive and happy lives. What we're seeing at the moment is just over-policing, over-incarceration, over-criminalisation of First Nation people. And I think if that stopped, you'd see a change.
George, in regards, you mentioned it before, the CCTV, allegedly there was body cam vision of what happened with these circumstances with this latest death in custody with Mr. White. Will that be released as part of the ongoing investigation?
Well, it's hard to tell. We're certainly not seeing it now, but the police have said publicly that they will release it once the criminal investigation is finished. We don't know when that will take place, and the family do not trust the investigation. They do not trust the narrative coming from the NT police. They want to see that footage, and until they do, they will not rest.
As we mentioned earlier, George, the Northern Territory Police are rejecting calls at this stage for any independent investigation. What do you think your realistic chances are of pushing back and actually getting that action for an independent investigation into what happened here?
Well, I think you're seeing an element of stubbornness both from the police and the politicians in government in the Northern Territory. Realistically, I'm not sure whether they will implement best practice. There are clearly conflicts of interest when police investigate police. It's a small jurisdiction, the Northern Territory. Everyone knows everybody else, and there should be. It is best practice to have independent investigators come in such situations. However, we're dealing with the Northern Territory, and I doubt that we'll see justice for First Nations people.
George, the Acting Police Commissioner in the Northern Territory, Martin Dole, has rejected these calls for an independent investigation, alleging it's not simply a matter that we can, quote, bring in an external body that doesn't have any powers. He alleges if they were to bring in an independent investigator, they have to be sworn in as members of the Northern Territory Police Force in any case, and I'm quoting him here, to utilise our powers under the Act. Is that correct?
Get over it. They can easily resolve those issues. In other states, they bring in investigators and independent prosecutors and have independent oversight. It can be done. It just takes commitment and a dedication to, providing accountability and justice to First Nations people. That's clearly not a high priority in the Northern Territory.
We appreciate your time, George. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Natarsha.
That was Lawyer George Newhouse. And that's it for this episode of the afternoon edition of The Briefing. We'd love you to subscribe or follow us on Instagram at The Briefing Podcast. I'm Natarsha Belling. Thanks for your company.